If it's Friday, Democrats in crisis. The White House forcefully pushing back on new questions about President Biden's memory and mental acuity as the special counsel's report triggers anger and panic in the party. Plus, trumping the GOP, the former president marches closer toward clinching the 2024 nomination with new wins in Nevada, the Virgin Islands, and in Congress, where he effectively torpedoed a bipartisan border security bill. And Israeli forces prepare to move into a city in southern Gaza packed with civilians who've evacuated from the north just hours after President Biden called Israel's offensive, quote, over the top, his sharpest criticism yet. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where Democrats right now are using words like nightmare and devastating to describe the situation they find themselves in. After special counsel Robert Hur decided not to charge the president with a crime over his handling of classified documents, but delivered a report with a blistering assessment of Mr. Biden's, quote, diminished faculties in advancing age. Today, the White House rejected the details on the president's mental acuity as untrue. And in a hastily gathered press availability last night, President Biden forcefully defended his memory.
I'm well-meaning, and I'm an elderly man, and I know what the hell I'm doing. I've been president. I put this country back on its feet. I don't need his recommendation. It's totally
How bad is your memory, and can you continue as president?
My memory is so bad, I let you speak. That's
your memory has gotten worse, Mr. President?
My memory has not gotten. My memory is fine. My memory. Take a look at what I've done since I become president. None of you thought I could pass any of the things I got passed. How'd that happen? You know, I guess I just forgot what was going on.
Mr. President, voters have concerns about your age. How are you going to assuage them? And do you fear that this report is only going to fuel further concerns about your age?
Only by some of you.
But the fact is, the American public does see his age and health as a cause for concern. Our latest NBC News poll shows 76% of Americans have major or moderate concerns about his physical and mental health in a second term. And that number includes majorities of every party, including 53% of Democrats. And even as the president sought to defend himself, there was this moment where he mixed up the presidents of Mexico and Egypt.
I think that, as you know, initially, the president of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in. I talked to him. I convinced him to open the gate. I talked to Bibi to open the gate on the Israeli side.
It also comes just days after Mr. Biden twice mixed up former European leaders, two of whom died years ago. The report's publication has some drawing comparisons to 2016 and the report from then FBI Director James Comey just months before the general election. But there are some key differences here. Reports on charging decisions by special counsels are required by federal regulations. And Attorney General Merrick Garland had previously promised transparency around these reports. But faced with an unflattering portrait of their candidate, some Democrats, including Vice President Kamala Harris, have attacked the special counsel directly, making similar points to what Republicans have said about former President Trump's own special counsel investigations.
The way that the president's demeanor in that report was characterized could not be more wrong on the facts and clearly politically motivated. Gratuitous.
You have to remember this, too. You have a Trump appointee now that's 350 pages to just say that Joe Biden isn't going to be indicted here, too. It was just a smear and cheap shots and just taking things out of context or even just inventing any of them, too.
Now, it should be clear, former President Trump, only 4 years younger than Biden, has had his own public mix-ups. Recently, he said Nikki Haley was in charge of the Capitol on January 6th instead of Nancy Pelosi. And unlike Mr. Biden, Mr. Trump does face criminal charges in 4 different indictments, including 40 counts in his own classified documents case. And despite what Trump says, the 2 classified document cases are not the same, a fact Hur made clear in his report. But as we come to the end of a week that could have been a messaging win for Democrats as Republicans killed the bipartisan border deal, Democrats are instead being forced to deal with a crisis where the messenger himself is the issue. NBC's Monica Alba is outside the White House, and NBC's Mike Memoli, our President Biden whisperer, is here with me on set. Monica, let me start with you. How is the White House responding today? How much concern is there based on the conversations you've had with your sources?
There's certainly a level of concern here, Kristen, about the narrative, and this is one where the White House wanted to take control of it today, and you did start to see that late last night when they did arrange for the president to do a really rare primetime news conference where he took some of those questions, where he, according to aides, really was the one who needed to come out and express his anger and frustration directly with the American people and with reporters. And this was something that he had flashed in private earlier. He had said after he read the Hur report to those around him, to his aides, that he couldn't believe that he would include some of the lines in there about his own memory, specifically as it relates to the allegation that he couldn't remember when his beloved son Beau had died. And so then senior officials essentially huddled and decided we need to send the president out there to deliver this message himself, and that's what you saw last night. Then today, Vice President Harris kind of took that a step forward by calling the report, as a former prosecutor herself, gratuitous, unprofessional, inappropriate, and really talking about taking issue with the facts of the matter and some of the larger questions that are in this when it comes to the president's memory as the oldest president ever to serve. So this is something where the White House decided they also wanted to put out a key spokesman in the White House counsel's office who doesn't normally brief from the podium to answer these kinds of questions. And here's a little bit of what Ian Sams had to say about their own view of the allegations in the Hur report. Listen.
We just reject that this is true. And I think that it does raise questions about the gratuitousness, and it raises, makes you wonder why that's in there. I dispute that the characterizations about his memory that were in the report are accurate, because they're not.
So this is really something where they believe and are taking this lead on the memory question because they needed to punch back on it. But they also are pointing to this larger point in the report, which, of course, did not bring any criminal charges against the president, but which they are saying and arguing the tone of the report was politically motivated. And they're saying, Kristen, that even if Robert Hur cleared him of any wrongdoing criminally, he amounted to a political indictment in terms of what he pointed out about the president.
It certainly did seem that way. Monica, stay right there. Let me turn to Mike Memoli here on set with me. Mike, thanks for being here. Talk to me about what your sources are telling you. And some of my conversations, Democratic strategists have said it's time for a change in strategy. And what that strategy should look like is President Biden being more out front for voters to see for themselves that he does, in fact, have the mental acuity to serve another 4 years. What are you hearing?
It's been so fascinating, Kristen, because you covered Vice President Biden along with me when he was in the Obama administration. And we've seen how unscripted Joe Biden, sort of everyman Joe, is both a challenge but also a political asset, and the ways in which the campaign and the Obama administration would either harness that or try to guard against it. Well, there's been that same push and pull within his own White House about whether they should let Biden be Biden, frankly. And there is a view now that's becoming, I think, a debate that has been behind the scenes that is bursting even more into public view now about the fact that they feel that they have been too controlling of the president for his own detriment. And so now those voices feel more emboldened to say we need to see this president out doing more events, being more visible, because the more the country sees him, the more they'll be reassured that he's able to do the job. Now, of course, there's a risk in that, and there's the very risk that's been the case throughout, that the more he's out there, the more he's exposed. And so this has been a push and pull. But the other thing that's been interesting is a lot of this strategy, and perhaps we don't maybe focus on this enough, is coming from the president himself. The anger strategy that we're seeing so clearly in the last 24 hours since this report has come out is coming from the president himself. He is, I'm told, so angry about especially the questions about his mental health. And we heard it last night, the insinuation that he didn't know his own son's death year is.
You could feel
just
the emotion when he talked about that.
And so the team is reacting to what the principal is saying. The principal is angry, and that anger is now being shown across the board, including, by the way, Kristen, at us. They think we are not doing an appropriate job of how we're covering that, and it's an important part of their pushback today.
Well, you lead me to my next follow-up to Monica, because, Monica, part of the messaging that we've heard from the Biden team is to lash out, frankly, yes, at the press, as Memoli just said, and then also, quite frankly, at the special counsel to say this is politically motivated. And again, it echoes what we hear from conservatives when they attack the challenges, the legal challenges that Trump has. Do you think that's a messaging strategy that we will continue to see take root?
Certainly. I think you're going to continue to see the White House point to the major differences and the essential differences between these two cases. And the number one at the top of that list is that they are really reminding people that President Biden cooperated fully, that when he found much of this classified information and realized it was classified, he did turn it over to the National Archives, and that he did sit for that voluntary interview. And a key point that they are making is that that interview took place just a day after the October 7th terrorist attack in Israel by Hamas, and that the president was juggling an international crisis while still doing hours and hours of interviews with the special counsel. So they are really saying that the differences between how the current president and the former president approached this, not to mention the fact that former President Trump has been indicted and is facing dozens of charges for his mishandling of classified information, is just a fact. Kristen.
Yeah, great stuff from the White House, Monica. Mike, one more question to you. The vice president has a number of high-profile events coming up, including in Munich. Is she going to be more in the spotlight, do you anticipate, as they deal with some of these challenges?
From the moment that President Biden announced he was seeking a second term, we have seen the vice president with a bigger role in this administration, frankly. And I thought what we saw today from her, pushing back as forcefully as she did, might have been one of the most important moments she's had as vice president. We've seen that in the past, the way Biden was Obama's validator and defender. She is now doing the same, and that's going to be a big part of her role in the campaign going forward.
All right. Really fantastic reporting. Mike Memoli, Monica Alba, thank you so much. And joining me now is Michigan Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. Congresswoman Dingell, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Kristen, it's good to be with you.
Well, it's always great to have you. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to what's in the special counsel's report. I'm going to read you a little bit of it. He writes in part, quote, "In his interview with our office, Mr. Biden's memory was worse. He did not remember when he was vice president, forgetting on the first day of the interview when his term ended, and forgetting on the second day of the interview when his term began." You have obviously interacted with President Biden on a regular basis. What do you think of that characterization? How do you respond?
Look, last night I was stunned, and the more I've read more today, I'm just angry at this point. I think that I'll use the vice president's word. These are gratuitous, cheap shots that are not true. I can, from my own personal experience of 1 week ago today, or yesterday, I spent more than 8 hours with the president. And I'm going to tell you a very personal story, which I would never have shared, except that we seem to think there's nothing that's off limit anymore. But the death of John's anniversary was Wednesday, which is February 7th. And see, I made a mistake. I know the date, but sometimes you make a mistake.
Yeah.
And Bo's birthday is the 3rd. And President Biden never forgets John's anniversary and knows how hard and tough it is for me and ties it together. And he on that plane last Thursday knew I was going to have a tough week and checked on me and wanted to make sure I was okay. And then we had lots of other conversations about issues that I get two of the worst issues that we talk about, autos and Arab Americans, and we had direct, blunt conversations. We talked about the politics of Michigan. He was on his game. He knew what he was talking about. He listened, and I've seen results of the discussions we've had last Thursday. So I take great offense from my own personal experience at the words that are used in that report.
Well, we appreciate your sharing such a personal and obviously emotional story. So thank you for that perspective. I do want to get your broader thoughts, though, on the fact that if you look at the polling, 76% of Americans, based on our latest NBC News poll, say that they do have concerns about the president's mental and physical health. 62% said those concerns were major concerns. Is the mere appearance of the fact that there might be something to be worried about a political liability?
Look, I think that's why you're seeing the White House take this so seriously. Now, you've got two men that are clearly going to be the candidates for president. The other person's age is not much younger than Donald Trump and than Joe Biden. See, we all keep making mistakes. And I would say, why aren't we talking about the 91 felon indictments that he has against him? I'm of the school, let Joe Biden be Joe Biden. When people see who he is, how on game he is, I think this is going to be a hard year. I think this is going to be something that we're going to be talking about. The publicity around this is just one more issue that's got to be dealt with. I'm not, you know me, I don't mince the facts. But I think these are the two candidates that we're going to be talking about. And Joe Biden has to go out and show people exactly who he is and all the good things he has done and why he is the right man for this job versus Donald Trump.
Let me follow up with you on that point, because I have spoken to some Democratic strategists today who say kind of what you just said, that President Biden's the only person who can fix this. He's the only person who can address this, and there needs to be a shift in strategy. He needs to be more out front so that voters can see, these strategists said to me, that he does have the mental acuity to serve another 4 years. What do you think that strategy should look like? Does it include more interviews with the press? Does it include more campaign events? What specifically would your guidance be?
Well, I've got to think about this. I'm not sure more press interviews with gotcha questions is the answer, to be perfectly frank. But when I saw Joe Biden walked in to that, I didn't even know what his schedule was going to be last Thursday. I knew we were going into a UAW hall. But when we went into that bar and grill, and there were people that didn't even know he was coming, some had been invited, and you watched him interact with everybody, he was in his element. He's the Joe Biden I have known for 40 years, and they trust him, and they like him, and they love him. Put him with real people. Let Joe Biden be real. Get him a little less in the bubble that people want to put him in. People will easily want to reelect him as president.
Let me tell you what a Democratic House member told my colleague, Peter Nicholas, quote, "It is a nightmare," referring to these developments. "It weakens President Biden electorally, and Donald Trump would be a disaster and an authoritarian. For Democrats, we are in a grim situation." What do you say to some Democrats who argue it may be time to consider a plan B, even though realistically there's not really time for that?
There isn't a plan B. So all of us we have got to get ourselves together and fight for our future, because a future with Donald Trump as president again should scare all of us, and what the consequences could be. And we've got to go out and tell, all of us have worked with this man. We know how good he is. We know what he's delivered on. You know what I'm tired of? I am tired of Democrats and Republicans are worse, who voted for the bipartisan bill, voted for the IRA bill, and then don't give Joe Biden any credit for his leadership. I've sat through presentations in my own state where they take credit for all these things, and Joe Biden's name is never mentioned, and yet every one of those was a federal dollar that came because of his leadership. And these Republicans that actually have the nerve to go out there to roads and bridges, or to even go into a senior's home. A Republican did this in Michigan and talked about how the price of their insulin was down to $35 now. They didn't vote for it. We got to remind people how people vote, what they do, what they don't do, and what our vision and what's been delivered on. I'm tired of words. We got to stop talking words. We got to show people what's been delivered on, what the actions are.
Finally, Congresswoman, I have to ask you, of course, about Michigan. We know that the campaign dispatched its campaign manager last week to talk to Arab American leaders there. You and I have had a number of conversations about Michigan. What's your level of concern at this very moment about President Biden standing in your state?
Look, it's a purple state. It's competitive, and it will probably be competitive until November. I'll tell you the truth, so I'm not going to lie about that. There were a group of people came out from Washington yesterday. I've talked to almost every single person that participated in a variety of meetings. I've talked to many people who refused to participate in those meetings. There is a lot of hurt. There is a lot of anger. I do believe that the effort is actually being made now to understand, to hear. These people want a ceasefire, and they want to, let's just hope there are no more deaths. There's some very dangerous things happening in the Mideast right now, and hopefully we're going to see a ceasefire in the next couple of weeks, and then you can move on to more productive conversations. They will not happen without a ceasefire.
Okay. Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, thank you so much for joining us on the heels of an incredibly busy week. We really appreciate it. Good to see you as always.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Coming up, the Israeli military is preparing for an offensive in a part of Gaza teeming with evacuees, a move that a top White House official says could be disastrous. I'll speak to the top Democrat on the Armed Services Committee next. Plus, trumping the caucuses, the former president secures 2 more wins in Nevada and the Virgin Islands, expanding his double-digit lead over lone rival Nikki Haley by 30 delegates. We're on the road with the frontrunner ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Civilians in Gaza are bracing for a major escalation in the war after Prime Minister Netanyahu today ordered the Israeli military to prepare to evacuate the southern city of Rafah ahead of a new ground assault. Since the start of the war, Gazans have been evacuating their homes in the north, fleeing to the south to Rafah at the direction of the Israeli government. That city is now estimated to be sheltering more than 1 million people. Much of Gaza has effectively been reduced to rubble, and those people now have nowhere else to go. Yesterday, ahead of the Israeli announcement, the White House called any potential operation in Rafah a disaster.
More than 1 million Palestinians are sheltering in and around Rafah. That's where they were told to go, absent any full consideration of protecting civilians at that scale in Gaza. Military operations right now would be a disaster for those people, and it's not something that we would support.
John Kirby there. Joining me now is Matt Bradley in Tel Aviv. Matt, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. So tell us what Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying about this anticipated military campaign in Rafah, and what's the response been on the ground so far?
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister has essentially called on the IDF to try to organize some sort of civilian evacuation from Rafah. But that is something that is really left a lot of questions, more questions than answers, and a lot of really harsh criticism from international organizations. We just heard from Amnesty International. They had a statement just now saying that panic is spreading among people in Rafah. We've been hearing from the Palestinian presidency saying that an attack on Rafah could lead to some sort of endless war. And, you know, this is not exaggeration. When we're talking about Rafah, this is the last place, the last readout for all of those Palestinians, more than 2 million of them, who have fled from elsewhere in the Gaza Strip. And we heard from John Kirby saying it's about 1 million. It's really more than, it's about 1.5 million is the number that's thought to be in Rafah right now. The rest of the Gaza Strip, as you noted, has been all but completely leveled. And now that city right on the border with Egypt is the last place left. These people don't have many other places to go. They really don't have anywhere to go at all. And that's why this call by Benjamin Netanyahu for an evacuation is stumping so many aid agencies and international organizations, and the residents themselves. They feel like they're just going to be bombed where they stand. Kristen?
Just terrifying to think about, Matt. Let me ask you, obviously we know Secretary Blinken was in the region. He was trying to get that potential deal that would include a temporary ceasefire as well as the release of the remaining hostages over the finish line. Where do those talks stand, Matt? How much hope is there that that can actually happen?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like we're going back to negotiations, but Secretary Blinken left empty-handed, went back to Washington without a deal. But he wasn't just there looking for this deal, which now looks as though it's either going totally back to the drawing board, though we have heard that Hamas officials are in Cairo trying to negotiate. Benjamin Netanyahu himself kind of left open a little bit of a window, saying there could be further negotiations. But, you know, Blinken's trip was also about tamping down regional expectations that there could be a wider war that could engulf the entire Middle East. And he's also trying slowly but steadily on a more ambitious background plan that the Biden administration has been pursuing, which is to eventually recognize a Palestinian state. Now, that is very, very ambitious, and it's something that's eluded a lot of his predecessors, a lot of Biden's predecessors. So, you know, there still is a lot of work to be done diplomatically, but when you're talking about that hostage deal, it really does look like that whole thing has been shrouded in pessimism, despite that we saw about 2 weeks ago all those leaders, including the CIA chief of the U.S., meeting in Paris, hashing out a presentation that they would then submit to Hamas. Hamas came back with some more maximalist demands, something that the Israelis said were non-starters. Benjamin Netanyahu himself called them delusional. So it looks as though both sides are as entrenched as they ever were before, and still we're seeing more than 100 of those hostages languishing in the Gaza Strip. We just heard today the Israelis reported that at least one of them may have been killed in Israeli airstrikes.
All right, Matt Bradley, thank you so much. Please do continue to stay safe. We appreciate your reporting as always. I now want to bring in Democratic Congressman from Washington, Adam Smith. He's also the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.
We are going to get to foreign policy news in just a moment. I do have to get your reaction to the special counsel report, of course, that raised concerns about the president's mental fitness. What was your reaction to some of those details, including that the president couldn't recall what years he served as vice president? We should note he forcefully pushed back against that characterization.
Well, look, it was gratuitous and insulting without any question. There was no point in including any of that in the report to conclude whether or not you were going to go forward with prosecuting. So it was clearly politically motivated in the way that it was worded. And look, at my interactions with the president, he remembers dates and all that just fine. Now, if you're having a deposition conversation in great detail about things that happened over the course of, 10, 12 years, a lot of people are going to mess up a date or not get it right. So I think it was clearly politically motivated in the way the special prosecutor worded it. I mean, there's just no other way to interpret it. He can decide whether or not to file charges, but he's not, any sort of doctor who can pass judgment on someone's mental acuity. So I think there was clearly a politically motivated effort in the way that was worded. It's gratuitous and unnecessary, and it doesn't accurately reflect the president's mental capability.
Congressman, we've noted that argument that it was politically motivated sounds a lot like what we've heard from conservatives when they lash out at prosecutors who are either investigating or who've already charged former President Trump. And of course, President Biden was not charged in this case. We want to make that clear. Is there a risk in accusing the special counsel of inserting politics into his report?
Well, facts do matter. Okay, you can read the report yourself and you can see the type of language that goes after personal character in a way that's got nothing to do with the charge. And you can reach the conclusion one way or the other. And then you can look at the facts in Donald Trump's case where he purposefully obstructed justice, refused to turn the documents over, tried to hide them in a variety of different ways. They had to get a subpoena to get them back. There are clear differences and distinctions, and people can make their argument going forward. But the key point here is you got to look at President Biden's record. I mean, certainly his record of legislative accomplishments that I heard my colleague Debbie Dingell mentioning earlier on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, on the CHIPS Act, on the Inflation Reduction Act, all of the things, that got done because of President Biden's leadership and desire to get legislative solutions to problems we face. He's navigating global crises. I've had conversations with him about the details of Israel and Ukraine and what's going on in the border. And he is on top of all of it. And it's really complicated and really difficult. So look, I mean, you can argue about President Biden's policies. You can certainly have arguments about how he handled these documents. I think that's a legitimate conversation, but to gratuitously take shots at his mental state, well, where does that fit into the investigation? And look, and if people want to say that I'm wrong, I'm being biased, make your argument. Make your case as to why that is a legitimate thing for a prosecutor to say. But I don't see that argument as having much weight behind it.
Before we turn to the Middle East, just very quickly, the report did say that the president willfully held on to these documents, even sharing some of the details with his ghostwriter. The report accuses the president of putting national security at risk. What say you? Did President Biden put national security at risk by holding on to and allegedly even sharing the contents of some of these documents.
Well, that would be the more straightforward, legitimate part of the report that the special prosecutor is right to analyze. And look, if what is reported in there is true, if the president said, yes, this is classified. Now, most of what they're talking about are notes that Joe Biden took, not actually didn't hand over actual documents or show actual documents in the way that President Trump is accused of doing. He was reading off of notes that he took. And whether or not those notes contain classified information, that was a judgment the prosecutor made. If they did, as he said, that was wrong. And it should not have been done. I can't argue with that. But again, the distinction between that and President Trump, grabbing all of his documents and refusing to turn them back and not cooperating in the investigation. President Biden cooperated at every step of this investigation. He turned the documents over willingly. So there is a big difference in that regard.
I do want to turn to the Israel-Hamas war and get your reaction to what President Biden said at that press availability that he held overnight. Take a listen, get your reaction on the other side.
I'm of the view, as you know, that the conduct of the response in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, has been over the top. There are a lot of innocent people who are starving, a lot of innocent people who are in trouble and dying, and it's got to stop.
Congressman, do you agree with that assessment, that Israel's actions in Gaza are over the top?
I agree with the part of the assessment that says that Israel ignoring a future for the Palestinians is wrong. It's bad for the security of Israel long term. Yes, there is a military component to this, and this is what I think a lot of people have pushed aside and ignored the position that Israel is in. Hamas is a clear threat, as we all know from the attacks on October 7th, and as we all know from the fact that Hamas has made no bones about the fact that their mission is the complete destruction of Israel. Israel has to deal with that threat. Hamas also hides behind civilians. They put their military operations in hospitals, in mosques, in schools, and it makes it very difficult to get at that military threat. I understand that. But another component of this is a non-military component, and that is to create a future for the Palestinian people so that Hamas doesn't have this power over them. Prime Minister Netanyahu is ignoring that component right now.
So has he been over the top, do you think, in Gaza?
Look, I'm using my words. Okay, that's President Biden's word. He can say it however he wants to say it. I don't know exactly what that means. All right, well, what that would mean to President Biden and why he said it. My words are they are not sufficiently concerned about the future of the Palestinian people or civilian casualties and humanitarian assistance right now. No question about that. Because if you don't have a future for the Palestinian people, you strengthen Hamas, you strengthen Islamic Jihad, and you undermine any ability to get to a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia and other Arab states who have said they're willing to do that with Israel, which could lead to a much more peaceful, more stable Middle East. But Saudi Arabia will not leave behind the Palestinian people. Something has to be done to build a future for them. And right now, Netanyahu is ignoring that. And I think it's a huge mistake, over the top, whatever you want to call it. I think it is a mistake for Israel's long-term security.
I do have to ask you about this aid package. The Senate cleared a procedural hurdle yesterday advancing this foreign aid bill. It would provide aid to Israel, as you know, and Ukraine and Taiwan, but it doesn't have any of the border provisions in it. If it came to the House, will you support that bill?
100%. This is something we should have done months ago. And look, I mean, the Republicans, they've said that they don't want to abandon Ukraine. Speaker Johnson says over and over again he doesn't want to abandon Ukraine. And then he said several months ago, but the border has to be attached to it. So, okay, let's go to work. We'll try to figure out the border, even though we haven't been able to do that for 30 years. We figure out, we get a bipartisan agreement, and then the Republicans say, you can't attach the border provisions to the supplemental. Ukraine needs that assistance right now desperately. Putin, as he has made clear, he will push as far as he can push. And if we don't get military aid to Ukraine, the very existence of Ukraine as a sovereign democratic state is in jeopardy. We need to pass that bill.
Can it get there in time? Because the original deadline was December, and now here we are in February.
Every day is a cost, okay? In time, I mean, Ukraine's not giving up. They're going to keep fighting. When it gets there, it's helpful. But every day is deadly dangerous for the Ukrainian people, every day that this is delayed. And understand, if we can get them that aid, if we can stop Putin's advance, That is what forces Putin to the negotiating table and would ultimately get us a peace agreement and what everybody wants, which is an end to the war.
All right, Congressman Adam Smith, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Hope you'll come back soon.
Anytime. Thank you.
Coming up next, former President Trump notches 2 more victories in the fight for the Republican presidential nomination. We'll take you live to the campaign trail in Battleground, Pennsylvania, where Mr. Trump is set to speak just moments from now. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Former President Donald Trump is on the campaign trail today in Battleground, Pennsylvania. He's set to speak shortly at an NRA forum in Harrisburg. Now, it comes a day after he expanded his delegate lead in the Republican primary, winning all the delegates in both Nevada and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Mr. Trump now has 63 delegates. Nikki Haley has 17. NBC's Garrett Hake joins me now from Harrisburg. So, Garrett, what are we expecting to hear from former President Trump? He didn't really make many references to the Hur report last night. He put out a statement about it. But what are you expecting today?
Kristen, I expect that to change today. And calling this a forum really does not paint an entirely accurate picture of the scene around me, because we are in a rodeo and farm arena. Someone's currently using a T-shirt cannon to keep the crowd entertained. This feels all the more like a general election rally, perhaps the first major general election rally of the season in the most important swing state. I fully expect Donald Trump to be on the attack about the Hur report today. But watch how he does it. Donald Trump doesn't so much attack Joe Biden's age when he attacks Biden on these kinds of issues as he does his competency specifically. He has long attacked the question of Biden's competency and ability to lead. His social media posts today have suggested he's well aware of every bit of this story, including the Mexico Al-Sisi part of the president's remarks last night. So I do expect to hear that brought up in some significant form here today. But lest you think the primary may be entirely behind him, Trump has also been attacking Nikki Haley on social media today with a call back to 2012. Ironically, some campaign events that I was at when Nikki Haley was stumping for Mitt Romney, then the nominee or nominee to be in that race, now persona non grata in much of the base of the Republican Party. So he is fighting a battle on 2 fronts. But Kristen, I can tell you, this is his crowd, this is his room, and having covered him at NRA events like this before, I fully expect him to give the crowd the red meat that they are eagerly awaiting, even now, more than an hour before he's scheduled to appear.
Yeah, the term red meat came to my mind as well, Garrett. Thank you so much for joining us from a very noisy NRA convention. Appreciate it. During President Biden's at times heated exchange with reporters last night, he remained emphatic that he's not only up to the job, but the best candidate to take on Donald Trump in the general election.
Mr. President, for months when you were asked about your age, you would respond with the words, "Watch me." Many American people have been watching, and they have expressed concerns about your age.
That is your judgment. That is your judgment. That is not the judgment of the press.
Mr. President, in December, you told me that you believe there are many other Democrats who could defeat Donald Trump. So why does it have to be you now? What is your answer to that question?
Because I'm the most qualified person in this country to be president of the United States and finish the job I started.
Joining me now on set is Idrees, Kahloon, Washington bureau chief for The Economist. Symone Sanders-Townsend, former senior advisor to Vice President Harris and host of The Weekend on MSNBC, and Republican strategist Doug Heye. Thank you all for being here on this very busy Friday. Idrees, I want to start with you. Set the stage for the fallout after the special counsel report about President Biden. He, of course, said, I'm not going to indict him, but his characterization of his memory lapses were in some ways very damning.
Yeah, this reminds a lot of people of the Comey incident when James Comey came out in the 2016 election and said that he wasn't going to charge Hillary Clinton with mishandling classified information, but he still gave a conference that people still remember, I'm sure the Hillary folks remember, in which he said that she had made some mistakes. And here the Biden folks feel the same way, that although the special counsel said that there aren't going to be charges, he did say, they think gratuitously, that he had memory problems in his interviews. And this speaks to basically the chief vulnerability of the president. He is right now the oldest president ever to serve in the office. Every day that passes, he sets a new record. This is going to be the big issue of this campaign. It's one that Donald Trump is going to leap on. Nikki Haley, who's not going to be the nominee, I don't think, but she put out a press release saying that the White House is not a nursing home, and that kind of rhetoric really speaks to voters.
Yeah, Symone, pick up on that. But
press release coming in hot.
But pick up on this idea. I mean, here we had President Biden fired up.
Yeah.
Coming out last night, I spoke to some Democratic strategists. They said, boy, they were excited to see him get out there and throw some punches right up until the point where he confused the leader of Egypt with Mexico. Did that help him? Did it hurt him? Do you want to see more of this? Is this the way around it?
I think that the best answer to the question of is Joe Biden up for the job is the answer that the president continuously gives. He said, just watch me. And the White House, the campaign, and the president himself has to ensure that he is creating space and place for people, in fact, to watch and see him. And so during the press conference in prime time at 8 p.m., where all of the networks came to take it because they wanted to see what Joe Biden had to say, that matters. Him being fiery, I absolutely think matters. But, I mean, the president travels all the time, all across this country, speaking in rallies and town halls and doing OTRs. I think it's also important in those events that the president is speaking to local media, that he's talking to local television reporters and local print reporters, that the White House does more press conferences to allow the American people to see the president taking questions from reporters. And I think there was lots of criticism of the White House reporters last night from folks, and I'm like, White House reporters hadn't had a press conference.
Right.
And the yelling is actually par for the course. Don't say we like the yelling, but it is what it is. And so I think that it is really critical that folks don't get bogged down in the minutia of the tit for tat. When Joe Biden was a senior, Donald Trump was a freshman. But the question is who could do the job? And I think that's what the campaign and the White House are trying to say and do, but they have to lean in.
Doug, what is your reaction to that and the fact that the bottom line is Biden wasn't charged and Trump faces 4 indictments? And yes, in the primary race, it seems to be only emboldening him, but it could play very differently in a general election. And ultimately, this seems to be shaping up as a choice election.
Well, I think ultimately the age issue is the biggest problem that Biden has. And every poll that we see shows the same thing, that voters are overwhelmingly concerned with Biden's age. Look, they think Trump's crazy. They don't necessarily think he's too old. Yes, he was a freshman when Biden was a senior. He was a crazy freshman. Joe Biden, they look and they see that he's not necessarily stable every day. And what we saw from the report sort of speaks to that. So when he invokes his son and then says, I remember the rosary from Our Lady of, and can't finish that sentence. When he mixes up names, Trump mixes up names too, it speaks to that mindset that voters already have. It reminds me of in August 1994, I went to Merriweather Post Pavilion, not far from here, and saw Frank Sinatra. And one minute he was doing great with Come Fly With Me. 5 songs later, he struggled to remember the words of My Way. And that's what the audience remembered, was the bad parts of it, not the good parts. And yes, you want to get your principle out there, but it's a double-edged sword for Biden on this, because if he has more moments like this and he gets older every day, it's more risk.
Can I just use the word gaffes? Remember gaffes? I used to work for Joe Biden, obviously. And folks used to say, oh, he's a gaffe machine. Do you not want him out there? You know, every time he comes out there, he'll say these different kind of things. Gaffes have now turned into, he might be senile. So I do think we need to put it in perspective.
It's a really interesting point, because someone who I spoke with said it's baked into the cake with Joe Biden. It always has been. Let him get out there. Let Joe Biden be Joe Biden. Doug's point, Idrees, speaks to the frustration that so many Americans feel with what seems to be shaping up as this rematch between Biden and Trump. And that's why there's this frustration with it and this desire, frankly, so many Americans would say, to have another candidate, another choice.
Yeah. You see, I mean, Robert F. Kennedy is going to be running Cornell West, and you were reporting earlier, right, about how the Biden folks are going to Michigan because they're worried about storing up their base there. Those people might go to third-party candidates. If you look at polling, I mean, the vast majority of this country doesn't really believe that Biden is up to the task. A lot of them don't want Trump to run either, but both parties are in this equilibrium where they can't really shake, their octogenarian people at the top of the ticket.
And one of the things, we kind of made this point at the top, but it bears repeating right now. This was a week where Democrats were starting to have a really good week because the Mayorkas impeachment articles didn't get enough votes to pass in the House. The Democrats are moving forward with this standalone aid package. I mean, Democrats kind of had the momentum heading into this week and then lost it at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And moments like this are ones that the president doesn't want to repeat. But again, he's going to have to run a campaign. He's going to have to be out there. 2020 was different. It was COVID. It was lockdown. There was an ability to control the cadence of the press. But, this White House is pretty closed off. It's going to need to open up if it wants to make gains. And a lot of polls at the moment show Trump leading Biden by a few points.
And Kristen, this was a bad week for House Republicans, no doubt about it. They lost 2 votes in a row. I've never heard of that happening. But that's what people in Washington were paying attention to. Everybody in the country has now seen multiple instances of where they're questioning of whether or not Joe Biden is up to the job or not. And no, they don't want Donald Trump either. They're looking at this election and saying it's the resistible force against the movable object, and they're just not happy with it. I think it means a lot of voters may stay home or look to third-party candidates, which could tilt results in Michigan or Arizona or North Carolina. Where have you?
I don't know if many voters actually heard about the report. What they heard was that somebody said that Joe Biden was elderly and couldn't remember in an interview, and they saw the headlines, and now they see the president reacting to that. And I think that is really important to underscore here. They do know that House Republicans haven't passed anything, and it's the most unproductive Congress in like almost a generation. So I would not say that that the week actually ended badly for Democrats. I think that it's still a bad week for House Republicans. I think that if it's ended badly for Democrats, it's because they rolled over instead of defending their president, and I don't know how to account for that.
Very, very quickly, your predictions about what happens in Congress. Do you think they're going to get this aid package passed?
Well, I know that Amy Klobuchar has offered some amendments to the Senate supplemental. They're bipartisan amendments. There are a number of Republicans that are on that. I think the Senate is going to do their job. I don't know about the House. I'm very concerned.
What are you looking at me for?
Tell us what's going to happen.
Look, if they're able to get a vote, it passes. What we don't know yet is if the Speaker is going to schedule the vote. And part of that is a reflection of what happened this week.
Yeah. All right, guys. Great Friday conversation. Thank you all, Idrees, Symone, and Doug. Appreciate it. And still to come, with billions of dollars in U.S. aid for Ukraine barely making progress in Congress. As we just said, the situation is becoming increasingly dire on the front lines. Former ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, joins me next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. President Biden met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz last hour in the Oval Office. The president once again urged Congress to pass aid to Ukraine, calling the failure to do so, quote, criminal, neglect, and outrageous. The Senate did take a small step forward yesterday, clearing a procedural hurdle on a foreign aid package that has been stuck for months in Washington gridlock as the situation on Ukraine's front lines appears to be deteriorating. Ukraine's military is facing a critical shortage in ammunitions and artillery. Ukrainian officials say they are now saving and rationing whatever weapons are left. And just yesterday, a major shakeup in Ukraine's military leadership. President Zelensky ousting his top general following reported tensions between the two over the strategy of Ukraine's counteroffensive. Joining me now on set is Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and vice president for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ambassador Taylor, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Kristen.
You were just in Ukraine 2 weeks ago. Speak to what we just talked about, the fact that they're now rationing ammunitions, military supplies. What did you see? What was your big takeaway from being there?
Takeaway, Kristen, is exactly what you were just talking about. They need this assistance from the United States. The first thing they will say to every American that they come to is, thank you for your support. And then they say, and we need more. And they need it for the reasons that you said. They are rationing 155 is artillery rounds. The Russians don't have to do that. The Russians are getting them from, like, North Korea. And we are not able to supply them the same amount that they need in order to defend themselves against Russian attacks. The same thing is on the anti-aircraft weapons. The anti-aircraft missiles that knocked down most of the missiles, used to knock down most of the missiles, like 70, 80%. Now it's down to like 50% that they're knocking down because of what you said, they're rationing there. So they need U.S. support. They know that the Europeans are doing well. Europeans are stepping up, but the Europeans don't have the weapons that we do.
So they had said, we need this by December. We are now in February. What does that mean about their ability to fight this war? Is this a stalemate? Are they afraid that this could potentially lead to a devastating setback militarily?
If they don't get the assistance, if this bill doesn't pass, there will be a setback. They will have a hard time winning. They can't win without this. If the assistance comes, then it can replenish. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about taking ammunition out of U.S. stocks, sending it to Ukraine, and then replenishing that, buying the stuff from American manufacturers. So it stays here, but it goes to the Ukrainians and they can then defend themselves. Now, they are declining. They're not going to fall off a cliff. They're going to ration it, as you said, and they're waiting for the new supplies to come.
What is the counter argument that Ukrainian officials make to lawmakers here in the United States, many of them Republican, who say we are not clear on what the end game is in Ukraine, and they haven't made it clear to us how they're going to get there? What do Ukrainian officials say about that?
The Ukrainian officials are very clear about their end goal. Their end goal is very simple to say, and that is get the Russians out of our country. We just want the Russians out of Ukraine. That's their goal. Now, they also will say that a lot of that has to be militarily, so they need this assistance. Some of it is going to be after the military part. They're willing to have conversations after they can get back to borders that they can defend. So that's how they get there. And they recognize it's been difficult the last year, stalemate on the ground, not stalemate, by the way, in the air and on the sea, but stalemate on the ground. They need to rebuild, retrain, replenish. They get new soldiers into the frontline troops. That's going to happen over this next year. They got this new general who's going to be doing exactly that.
Well, let me ask you about this shakeup. President Zelensky announcing he's replacing his top general. What is the impact of that? Were you surprised by this move?
This was coming. When I was there, this was in the air.
Okay.
It was coming. It was not clear who would take his place. There were a couple of candidates. General Zaluzhny, whom I met with a couple of times while I was there, is a very popular general. He did a great job. And one of his subordinates, this General Syrskyi, is taking over after him. They worked together very well. In the beginning, when they pushed the Russians back out of the country very early on, they worked together and accomplished that. So General Syrskyi knows what he's talking about. He's got the different reputation from General Zaluzhny.
What do you make of the reports that are coming out of Ukraine that this isn't a stalemate? Is that an accurate characterization based on what you saw while you were there?
So on the ground, the Russians can throw troops, convicts, soldiers at the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't have the ability to defend themselves in the same way using the artillery as we were just talking about. So yes, the Russians, frankly, are making some small but noticeable progress in the east. They are not having success. The Russians have been pushed out of the western part of the Black Sea. So it is a complicated military situation.
And what do you make of, and we've had this conversation before, a lot of people say the only way for this war to come to an end is for Ukraine to give some of its territory to Russia, Crimea, for example. Do you think that would ever happen to get Putin to the negotiating table?
So, Kristen, when you talk to Ukrainians about that, the first thing they will say is those territories, the 20% of Ukraine that Russia occupies, it's 20% of their people. And they know what happens to their Ukrainian colleagues and compatriots when they live under the Russians. It's horrible. It is horrible. The atrocities are unmentionable.
All right, Ambassador Bill Taylor, thank you so much for being here. It's always good to see you. We really appreciate it. We'll be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. I will have exclusive interviews with Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, former Governor Chris Christie, and Mitch Landrieu, national co-chair for the Biden campaign. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.